Hello, welcome back. So, after a little bit of deliberation as to what was going to be the next book to read to you, I pulled out one which I thought I was going to do and then realised that was about fairies and pixies again. I thought, well, we've just done one like that. So I picked up a book which I loved when I was a child. There's no dust cover, which is the paper cover you normally get. So I haven't got a pretty picture to show you. That's probably backwards, isn't it? It's called The Ship That Flew. It is by Hilda Lewis. I can't remember the story at all. So all I can tell you is that it's about a ship that flew. I'll show you some of the pictures that come up as we go through because they're quite nice. So the first chapter, chapter 1, The Magic Begins. It all began with Peter's toothache. You wouldn't think anything really nice could come out of having a toothache, would you? Well, this time it did. But I'd better go right back to the beginning and explain. There were 4 of them, Peter and Sheila and Humphrey and Sandy, which is short for Alexandra Grant. I didn't know that was short for Alexandra. Their father was a doctor at Radcliffe. At least, he didn't live in Radcliffe itself, which is a popular little seaside town, but just outside, in Radcliffe Village, where the houses are old and set back from the road in large gardens, shaded in summer by ancient trees. The people who live in these old houses turn up their noses at Radcliffe, though I can't think why, because Radcliffe is just as pretty in its way. It is a nice, bright little town with lots of jolly shops, and you can get pink rock with Radcliffe stamped right through it, and ice cream cornets every yard or so. And if that isn't nice, I should like to know what is. The children who live in Radcliffe Village aren't encouraged to go into Radcliffe during the months of July and August, which are called the season, and they are never allowed to go in by themselves. For one thing, the roads are dangerous then because of all the cars dashing up and down the high street, which is the only important street. There are other reasons too, but that is the best one. Did I say never allowed? Well, that was a mistake because Peter was allowed once because of his toothache. When Peter had toothache, his mother always took him in to see Mr. Frinton. And when Mr. Frinton had finished doing good work on Peter's teeth, Mother always took him out to tea and gave him a pink and white ice when it was in season and pink and white rock when it wasn't. Because when your visit to the dentist is over, you are allowed to eat anything if you are careful. Well, this particular day, Mother couldn't take him because she was ill. She was in a nursing home, in fact, but the children didn't know that because Mother and Father didn't think children ought to be worried with grown-up things. So Father called Peter into his study, which was also the room where he saw his patients, and said, "Listen, old man." And then Peter knew that Father wanted him to do something really grown up because he always called him old man on those occasions. Then Father explained that there wasn't anyone to take Peter into Radcliffe, so Peter would have to go by himself. "But you can manage perfectly well," said Father, "because you're sensible and grown up. Here's a shilling for your fare, and a shilling for your tea, and a shilling for yourself if Mr. Frinton says you've been brave. You must ask him before you keep that shilling. There's a bus at 2:10, and you'd better take a return. There'll be 2p change." So Peter went upstairs to the bathroom to wash his face, and he was particularly careful to clean his teeth, which is a thing you must never forget to do when you visit the dentist. There was an excited sort of feeling inside him, partly because of going into Radcliffe by himself, and partly because of being brave about Mr. Frinton. There was 6p in his money box, and he got it out with a knife and put it in his pocket, because it might come in useful just in case he didn't get that extra shilling. Just as a side note, you'll need to ask your parents what shillings, sixpence and twopence are. See if they know. Peter caught the bus and paid his fare, but whether it was that he didn't speak up or whether the conductor wasn't listening, I don't know, but he only got a single ticket into Radcliffe. Peter was a little bit sorry, because now he'd have to take that extra twopence off his shilling if he was brave, or off his tea money, or his sixpence if he wasn't, because Father had distinctly mentioned a return ticket. But, as it happened, it all turned out for the best, as Peter had to admit when he thought about it afterwards. Well, he went to Mr. Frinton's, and he was brave, and Mr. Frinton said so without being asked. And as it was early, Peter thought he would stroll about Radcliffe and have a good look around. He strolled about, looking into the windows of all the bright little shops. They all seemed to be selling the same kind of thing. Peter thought. They all seemed to be selling the same kind of thing, Peter thought. China with coats of arms on it, and buckets and spades, and paddling shoes, and bathing suits, and toys. And you can see him there, looking into the shop. Peter looked at the toys, but he couldn't see anything he wanted. There were kites, but he had a kite, and balls, but he had several balls, and jigsaws and cricket bats. There were other things too, but they cost much more than 1 and 6. What I'd really like, Peter said to himself, is a boat, a nice little boat, but that would cost a good deal more than 1 and 6. He looked carefully at all the cheap boats in all the windows, but they looked cheap. The paint was sticky and they weren't a good shape. They wouldn't balance, Peter thought sadly. He decided that he would go down to the beach and have a look at the pierrots. Pierrots? Now, I don't know what that is. Pierrots. Pierrots? Don't know. Then he would give himself a glass of milk and some shiny brown buns and a pink and white ice, and then catch the 6 o'clock bus home. So he took the first turning that led down to the sea. It was a narrow little street and rather dark, with old houses set close together. Peter was rather surprised. He didn't remember this street, and, what was more, he hadn't known there were any old houses in new little Radcliffe-on-Sea. But then, he told himself sensibly, I don't know everything. On the left-hand side of the dark little street was a dark little shop. Such a dark little shop that you could hardly make out what it sold. Peter crossed the road and stared into the dark little window. He could just make out an old oak table covered with blue and white saucers and strings of beads and a couple of copper kettles. And then, all of a sudden, his heart gave a great jump because he saw it. He saw it, and he fell in love with it immediately. It was a tiny ship, not longer than 6 inches, carved in some old dark wood. He stared at it so long that, in spite of the dimness of the window, he could make out everything about the ship. The tiny round shields, smaller than 3-penny bits, that hung over the sides, and the boar's head carved in gilt, that seemed to grin at Peter in a friendly manner, though it was a very fierce boar indeed. Peter wondered how much the little boat would cost. It would cost a great deal, he was certain, and yet he couldn't go away and leave the dear little boat, the friendly little boat, behind. And then, suddenly, without knowing just how it happened, he was standing inside the dark little shop. A tiny far-off bell tinkled and stopped. Nothing happened. Peter went on standing there, afraid to move, in case he knocked something precious off a table with his elbow or trod on something precious with his foot. It seemed to him that he stood there a long time without anything happening. He was just thinking that he had better open the door and let himself out into the street when something happened. He heard the sound of far-off steps coming from somewhere at the back of the house. They came nearer and nearer, and then an old man stood beside him. He was a very old man indeed, and over one eye he wore a black patch. "What can I do for you?" asked the old man. "Please," said Peter, "could you tell me the price of the little ship, the one in the window?" The old man didn't stir. He just stood there looking hard at Peter. "You like that little ship?" he asked at last. Peter nodded. He couldn't explain just how much he did like it. The old man moved towards the crowded little window. "They don't make ships like that nowadays," he said a little sadly. "Is it very old?" Peter asked, hoping that it wasn't, because very old things, he knew, often cost a good deal of money. The old man nodded. "Older than anyone would believe," he said, softly stroking the tiny ship with gentle hands. "She's a beauty," Peter said, with all his heart. "Yes, she is a beauty," agreed the old man, holding it as carefully as if it were an egg that he might drop. "How much is it?" Peter asked, his heart beating very fast. "All the money in the world wouldn't have bought this once," the old man answered. "No, not if it were prince, nor king, nor emperor himself." Peter didn't know what to say to this, so he said, "Could I buy it, do you think?" Then the old man said a strange thing. "It would cost all the money you have in the world, and a bit over." Peter put his hand in his pocket and pulled out his money. There were 2 silver shillings, a 6pence, a 3-penny bit, and 3 pennies neatly spread out on the dark counter. "3 shillings is the price," said the old man gravely, and put the little boat into Peter's hand. It was only when Peter stood outside, blinking in the sunshine after the darkness of the shop, that he remembered that he had spent his tea money, which didn't matter much, and the 2 pence belonging to his father, which mattered rather more, and his fare money, which mattered a good deal. Yes, he had done what the old man had said. Without realising it, he had paid all he had in the world, and a bit over. Well, as for the 2 pence, he would borrow it from one of the others and pay it back next week, but if he meant to get home that night, he had better start right away. And then he remembered the shortcut across the sands. You can see a picture of the old man in the shop handing him the boat. He heard the big clock on the bandstand boom out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. "If I hurry, I can do it easily," he told himself. He gave his little ship one last loving look and then put it carefully into his pocket. It was only when he was striding along the firm wet sand, his shoes dangling by their laces from his neck, that he remembered something and whistled. The ship was at least 6 inches long, and he hadn't a pocket that size, and yet it had slipped quite easily into his pocket. He took the ship out of his pocket and looked at it again. Yes, it was 6 inches, and over, nearer 8 as far as he could judge. He put it back again. It slipped in easily. "Must have been something the dentist put in my tooth that makes me muddled," he thought, and went on whistling. He was as happy as a king. The bad tooth was out, and his little ship was in his pocket. His fingers kept playing with it as he walked. He was wondering what the others would think of it. The girls wouldn't care for it much, of course, but Humphrey would love it. He wondered whether Humphrey would clean out the rabbit hutch if he were allowed to handle the new ship. He wandered on, his mind full of his new toy. He had forgotten where he was, and, what was more important, he had forgotten the time. Now, it was a great mistake to forget the time, the greatest mistake of all, and I will tell you why. It was because Peter's way lay round a tiny bay which was the most dangerous for miles around. The beach sloped suddenly down from the cliffs to the sea, and when the tide came in, it came with a rush and a pour and a swirl to the cliff's edge. The water in this little bay would be deep and dangerous, even when the tide was not full elsewhere. And there was Peter strolling along that very bay, whistling, and his fingers playing inside his pocket where the boat lay. Suddenly he raised his head. Then he stopped, dead still, staring at the tangle of green and yellow water that was racing towards him. He looked widely about him. The cliffs rose sheer and white and unfriendly on all sides. Before him, the oncoming waves swept inwards, drew back with a sucking noise over stone and pebble, swept inwards again, spreading their pattern of yellow lacy foam nearer and nearer. Peter was frightened, more frightened than he had ever been in his life before. All sorts of ideas came muddling into his head. His mother and father, his brother and the sisters he would never see again. He said a little prayer and felt rather braver, but not so very brave. The water was so near now that it was licking over his bare toes. He gave a little groan. He said aloud, I wish I could get home." There was a tugging inside his pocket, as though something was moving, something like a bird, something that strained and strained to be free. Without knowing what he was doing, Peter put his hand in his pocket and drew out the ship. It started to grow in his hand. He stared at it in amazement. The water was up to his knees, but he had forgotten the water. The boat was growing larger and larger. It was floating gently on the waves. A bright sail unfurled itself. The ship was just large enough to hold one little boy. Peter scrambled over the edge. The sail spread itself. The golden ball was dazzling in the sunshine. The ship rose slowly into the air. It held a steady course above the tumbling, foaming sea. Above the white cliff wall it rose, above the green cliff tops where people walked and raised their eyes to the wonderful bird of gold and scarlet and blue. On flew the boat, and on flew Peter, not knowing whether he was on his head or his heels. Magic. Magic had happened to him. He knew it would some day. He had always believed in magic, even when the others had laughed at him, laughed because he was the eldest and ought to know better. He leaned over and patted the side of the ship. He had to clutch hold tightly, for he nearly fell out. He was not yet used to flying in a magic ship. When he looked again, he saw that they were dropping, although the movement was so gentle that he had not noticed it. Treetops floated up to meet him and floated away again. Roofs of horses went by like red mushrooms. The green earth rose up to meet him. With the gentlest movement, like a butterfly settling, the keel of the boat touched the grass. Peter stepped out, but this time he didn't stare, because magic had become the most natural thing in the world to him. The bright sails were rolling themselves up. The boat was shrinking, shrinking, shrinking. Soon there was nothing to be seen but the toy that had so taken Peter's fancy. He picked it up gently from the grass, wrapped it in his handkerchief for fear of damaging it, and put it in his pocket. Then he looked round. He was on the cliff path that sloped downward to the house. He was whistling like a thrush as he ran down the path to meet the others. This is good. Now I remember why I loved this book when I was a child. Right, that's it. First chapter. See you all tomorrow. Bye-bye.